pleasure to welcome everyone. I think we have a timely topic as far as changes to the food system after COVID and some great presenters this morning or afternoon, wherever you're located. It's 10 o'clock out west here. I'm going to have my vice committee chair just briefly introduce himself, and then we'll turn over to Steve Morgan, who's the Southern Region vice chair, and he's going to be moderating things. So Andrew, go ahead and introduce yourself. Maybe they can't hear it. Let's see. Well, Andrew Sandine is from Pennsylvania for the Northeast region. Betsy Green is from Arizona, and she's the Western region. And Kyle Hope is from North Dakota State, and she's the North Central. So with that in mind, we'll turn it over to Steve.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It is afternoon in Georgia. I'm Southern Region Vice Chair, Animal Science Committee. Like Mark said, I'm in west central part of the state, right on the Alabama line. We've got two really good speakers today. Dale Sandlin, Executive Vice President of Georgia Cattlemen's Association, and Chris Pravat, Extension economist at the University of Florida. They're going to talk to us about changes in the food system as it relates to COVID. I'm going to do a short bio on both of them at the same time, so we don't have to stop in the middle. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring the chat box. We'll get them all at the end, and we'll go from there. We're going to start with Dale. Dale is from, he works in Georgia now, but he was from the Hawaii, he was managing director of the Hawaii Cattlemen's Council, the Hawaii Beef Industry Council, and the Hawaii Rangeland Stewardship Foundation. He grew up on a small ranch in Olney, Texas. He raised cattle and wheat, taught him hard work, good ethics, and understanding of how every segment in the industry works. As managing director of the Hawaii Cattlemen's Council, he grew and expanded service to its members, improved the organizational structure, statute, and recognition in Hawaii state legislature. So he serves as a lobbyist for the association also. They work to create cooking demonstrations, featuring local chefs, found new events to promote beef, and improved the ability for the beef industry to tell their story. Chris Pravat is Extension, state specialized extension agent. His area is beef, cattle, and forages, enterprise budgeting and management. He focuses his work on economics of livestock and forage management practices and marketing strategy for cattle producers. His efforts work to educate extension faculty and clientele on management practices that increase the profitability of livestock and forage producers. He works to develop and maintain enterprise budgets for cow-calf operations, generate decision aids for producers to analyze profitability, provide economic insight on cost-effective management practices, develop a marketing plan to evaluate marketing alternatives, and he works for agribusiness development and financial management. So really two high quality guys that are going to talk to us. We're fortunate to have them. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dale.
Thank you, Steve, for that glowing introduction. As Steve said, I am currently the Executive Vice President of the Georgia Cattlemen's Association. After the 5 years that I spent out in Hawaii, gave me a little bit of a different view than what some of the other producers have had to deal with. I'm glad to say that there's no lava outbreaks in the state of Georgia, but if there was, been there, done that, and can help walk you through that. Just a little bit about me and my background. As Steve said, I grew up in Olney, Texas on a cow-calf operation. We also raised wheat. As you see here on the screen, this is my family. My wife, Miranda, who is a faculty member at Auburn University, and then our daughter, Emily, we call Emmy. So she is definitely keeping us on our toes. Georgia Cattlemen's Association, our mission here is to unite and advance Georgia's cattle industry. And whether the ways that we do that is everything from, as Steve said, legislative representation. I do serve as the lobbyist, but we also provide market development opportunities, educational opportunities for, and then fellowship as well with them. So let's talk a little bit about the cattle industry. And I kind of looked at this as how it relates to COVID in the run up to COVID, what happened in the middle of COVID, and now as we start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Initially, we saw the empty meat cases, kind of the panic buying that happened within the industry, which was a great benefit for us. We knew that it kind of told us what we already knew, that the consumers want our product, and they're willing to pay the money to get our product because it does provide that sense of home to them, that comfort sense. However, that created some issues on the supply chain side. Meat cases are the blessing and the curse, right? The blessing that you sold the beef, the curse that you have to refill those shelves. And unfortunately, because of the way that our supply chain works, it required specific focus in how that product was to get to market. So we had to shift from the product that was already going through the retail or going through the restaurant and institutional use side, shifting those back over to the retail sector. In addition to that, we had a record number of cattle on feed. And that's important to know because the processing plants were already working at the highest levels that they could. Producers were seeing lower value on their live cattle at the time because of that. There wasn't really the demand for those cattle to run through the processing plant. As COVID began its expansion throughout the country, we saw a lot of decreased processing throughput due to those social distancing requirements. Many of the plants that had been retrofitted did not expand the facility. They inserted the new equipment, and therefore, in order to keep that supply chain running at the optimal speed, you had to put people closer together. Due to social distancing requirements, they had to spread them all apart, add in specific protocols as far as temperature checks and PPE and dividers between people on the line. Even some of our plants were even sending cleaning supplies home with their staff to ensure that they had the same high quality cleanliness standards there. We saw the spike in beef prices and a volume dollar gap of around 30%. What GCA focused on through all of that was obviously how do we keep things running? So it was securing the critical infrastructure determination. That was our number one thing. If we can't get to our pastures to take care of the animals, we've got major problems. So it was focusing on that. We assisted the processors with their social distancing and PPE requests, worked on hours of service determinations, provided supply chain resources for retailers so that they can meet the demands of the consumers. So that was where we focused in the run up. As COVID continued to expand, our producers were forced to hold those cattle longer. That disrupted their hay production, increased the holding costs of those, and kind of shifted them out of a normal production cycle to an extent. So that was one of the major concerns that we looked at there. We had limited stockyard activity for a couple of weeks there in March, and we saw, again, another disruption in the marketing component for those producers who may have needed the capital to work. Again, the supply chain remained focused on the retail side of things instead of the restaurants. That reduced the amount of outlets that we have for the primal cuts and required additional processing considerations for those retail ready cuts so that they could go directly to the grocery stores and out on the floor. we saw the average loss to producers in 2020 estimated around $111.91 a head. Total for the overall country, we saw that $3.6 billion loss. Now that's just the cow-calf sector. Georgia is primarily a cow-calf state. We don't have any cattle feeders to speak of in any large scale. But the problem is when you have that many losses incurring at once, and we saw one of those black swan events the summer before COVID hit with the Hutchinson, Kansas plant fire. And so that kind of started the ball rolling. And then the pandemic hit the switch into full gear for everybody trying to figure out what's going to be the best solution and how do we address this. And so as we continued through the summertime, that became a major topic of conversation for us. And I'll talk a little bit about what GCA did through that. Now, as we're nearing the end of the pandemic, the processing plants were able to work through that backlog of cattle that they had on feed earlier in the pandemics back in March and April. And they did that through additional shifts and more work days. So a lot of those plants added a second shift if they weren't running it. A lot of the bigger facilities added another day to their schedule, added Saturday and some even Sundays to address that. We saw that the increased market demand pushed beef to the top of the protein chain in consumer purchases. We overtook chicken and poultry for a little bit there at around 58% of the market share, which was a great thing for our industry, right? We're seeing lots of people putting their faith in beef, and that was great for us to see. However, that doesn't mean that money translated back down to the producer. And so we saw that market disparity between the price of boxed beef and live value closed down a little bit, got a little more stabilized there, but that economic impact continues to push that conversation that we talked about on future losses. And so we continue to have those discussions almost on a daily basis. Our cattle producers, for the first time, began to receive direct payments from the federal government, which would be outside of any natural disaster payments for cattle. Obviously, with CFAP 1, CFAP 2, and now the top-up payments that are currently taking place. And much of our producers, while the COVID impacted the market more so than it impacted our producers' day-to-day lives and operations, it did change a lot of the ways in which we look at things. So now you're starting to see, our industry is starting to see an opening of that post-pandemic planning happening, specifically with different events, and our chapters are starting to meet again, which is great for them. I think we're all more than ready to get back to that sense of normalcy. So as I mentioned earlier, what were some of the discussions that were happening? Hopefully this dovetails well with what Mr. Chris is going to talk to us about, but we did have that record number of feed on cattle. We had the decreased processing throughput, which spurred those conversations. So what we did as kind of the southeastern states, we looked at all of these items, all of the different proposals that were being thrown out there. The 50% mandate by Senator Grassley out of Iowa. We had the 3014 proposal that was put out there, and then the bid to grid discussions that were happening. Both the 50% mandate and the 3014 proposals, those were required negotiated cash purchases by the processors to be able to try and bring more money back down to the cow-calf levels. There were some major fundamental flaws with some of those, and still remains to the 50% mandate that Senator Grassley has put forth. With that 50% mandate, it doesn't require how those cattle are to be purchased, only that those plants secure the 50%. So there could be the opportunity, at least for the processors, to band together and say, okay, we have to buy 50%. I'm going to pick one buyer. And instead of having the competitive market to be able to have multiple processors bidding against each other in an auction setting, now you set it down to one buyer that's going to buy at a spot price. And that's certainly problematic from our position. The 3014 proposal, 30 references the 30% of those cash negotiated trade right now. Well, in the last 6 months, our processing plants, the big four processors, have been purchasing at around a 28% from those negotiated cash purchases. So 30% is really not pushing the needle much. If they're already doing it voluntarily, there's not much need for them to do it on a mandated side. And then also looking at the bid to grid and how, another alternative marketing opportunity for our producers, and then our cow-calf risk management options. Unfortunately, there's not really a good cow-calf risk management option right now. But what GCA put together was a small working group that comprised of all of members from our executive committee all the way down to individual producers that could weigh in on this, livestock markets and processors as well. And so what we found through the pandemic is that Georgia cannot depend on the other states for our processing infrastructure. We can't rely on them to provide that. We noticed that a lot of our producers were starting to get more interested in creating their own processing within their own operations and exploring that foray into that side of the business. And so we have been working with them to not only secure that source of capital for them for processing expansion, but also for cattle feeding operations and primarily for labor. Labor continues to be the biggest challenge that we have as far as increasing the hook space that we have for cattle production. As I mentioned earlier, these are just some of the national issues that we are working on that are still out there and floating around. The CFAP 2 producer payments, they have reopened that now as part of, I'm not sure what we're calling it at this point, the CFAP 3.0 / top up payments. So that is back open for producers to still receive direct payments for the losses that they were incurred. It certainly would not make them whole, but it definitely improve their ability to continue to operate. The America's Conservation Enhancement Act that focuses on some of the black-headed vultures that we're seeing here, and basically allows producers the ability to secure a permit to be able to capture those, for lack of a better term, predatory actions that may happen during calving season. We have the Halls Act. We're still working on trying to secure that year-round exemption to the hours of service requirements. The Cattle Market Transparency Bill from Senator Deb Fisher, certainly to our side of the equation, seems to be one of the better legislative options to address those market disparities that we saw. And every state's going to be a little different on that bill specifically. We have the Price Act, which is kind of an omnibus bill. It creates a contract library similar to what swine has, provides grants for processing expansion, risk management, education for producers, and would also allow for state inspected meat to be sold across state lines. And that, especially as we saw during the crisis of the pandemic, would be very beneficial for our producers and processors to be able to move that product to get around there. And then lastly, the Fake Meat is the Real Meat Act, is marketing edible artificials truthfully, ensuring that beef nomenclature is codified into law, and ensuring that any change, we wind up with a level playing field against the plant-based proteins. So with that, I will turn it back over to Mr. Steve, and willing to answer any questions you've got.
Okay, we've got one question in the chat box, and I'm not sure if this would be you or Chris to better answer, but it says, how do you see extension fitting in and contributing to the changes happening, i.e. in regard to the beef industry, both the national level marketing issues and local concerns such as lack of processing capacity, also a concern here in Arizona. I know, Dale, we're dealing with that a lot in Georgia. The local processors are booking over a year out.
Right. Yeah. So extension plays a critical role in our industry. There's no doubt about that. And I do not envy the amazing task that you have before you, because you kind of have to be like myself. You've got to be an expert at everything and a master at nothing, really. So, but I would say continuing to work with the industry partners, with your state cattlemen's association. I know, especially there in Florida, or pardon me, in Arizona, you've got both Arizona cattle feeders as well as the cattle raisers, I believe, out there. And so continuing to work with them to try to help provide those resources, at least on the legislative side. They are living in it day by day and can help keep you up to snuff, so that way you're not you're able to answer those questions when put towards you. As far as processing capacity is concerned, the biggest resource that you can be for them is ensuring that they have a viable business plan, right? So one of the things that we're looking at here in Georgia, since we are not a primarily cattle feeding state, is what are some of those low-hanging fruits. So one of the things that we are looking at is trying to encourage anyone that wants to feed cattle, as we start to add processing capacity, that they rise on the same plane. It's very important to see the pipeline of cattle going into that feeding sector match the amount of processing capacity that we have. That's not always going to be the case, but what that may do is require your producers to shift their production practices. So instead of having a fall or a spring calving season like we have here in Georgia, they're going to be calving year round because they have to keep that pipeline going. Also looking at secondary opportunities, maybe some low-hanging fruit. Any dairy producers that have recently gotten out of dairy production, those guys are experts at feeding cattle, and allowing them that opportunity to be able to shift and stay within the cattle industry, but shift their operations over, could be a beneficial way to help improve the feeding status, but also find some synergies there that may not have been before.
Thank you. Any other questions for Dale?
And I'll hang around to the end as well. So.
All right, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so we'll move on to Chris. Welcome, Chris.
Awesome. So thank y'all for having me. I guess since last February, last March, April, really, we've been looking for that light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm going to hit on some of the same things that Dale mentioned, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about where we are in the market right now, and just looking at where we might go just based on some of the issues we've been having for the last year. Are we going to get through those issues, and what might be a reoccurring theme, just based on the things we've been working through. So Chris Pravat, beef cattle and forage economist down here at the University of Florida. I'm a SSA, so I'm county extension faculty, but I serve the whole state of Florida. Do a good bit of work in Georgia and Alabama as well. But just gonna get into it. So in terms of 2020, anytime we talk about economics, there's high risk, there's chaos in the market, like there was in terms of March and April. What works in terms of marketing? There's so much risk, there's so much uncertainty out there. How do you make contracts? How do you make guarantees in terms of financial obligations? So really a lot of handshake deals don't really work. A lot of people backed out of some deals March, April last year, and just the significant of a decline. Whenever we talk about the margins that are available to us in the beef cattle industry, and then think about what those producer impacts that we talked about in terms of a market price decline, just what really works in a volatile market, nothing does. So you just have to make the best of it that we can. So not much went smoothly, even after, the rush, even after the rush in terms of meat proteins there in early April, even after market prices improved. It really never seemed like things, even as prices were improving, never really seemed like things were really going smoothly for us, because we were always looking back towards the really high volatility time that we had in 2020. It reminded me a lot of 2014, 2015 in terms of, or 2015, 2016 in terms of second half declines, but 2020 was actually smooth compared to 2015 and 2016. So I just throw this out here just because I think, as we talk about the impact that COVID had, in terms of domestically, the recession actually began in February. Now, if you think about what you were doing in February, the first, I guess, 10 days of March, you really weren't worried about COVID for the most part. So the recession began due to more international impacts that we were seeing in terms of exports, in terms of trade that we were having. So the recession began in February based on the National Bureau of Economic Research. So the pandemic that really got going there in March, and specifically there those first 2 weeks of April, when a lot of states shut down, a lot of federal agencies shut down. That's when that recession really felt like it hit us. But it started back there in February. And that's important for us to understand, that this is also, in terms of the recession, it's also part of our economic cycle that we go through, our business cycle. So while there's uncertainty around the pandemic, and that contributes to it, it kind of flowed with our economic cycle when we would have been expecting a recession. So as I'm thinking about sorting through this year's challenges, expect the unexpected is, a common phrase that people use. Everything's on the table for us as we're trying to work our way out of COVID. Some of the things I'm sharing with producers is, whenever we're thinking about our business plan, is survive. The first thing I'm talking about doing with producers, developing a written plan, maintaining cash flow. We're still having cash flow problems. Even with the CFAP payments, even with the additional PPP loans, there's still a lot of operations. If they hit this market wrong, CFAP and PPP loans might not have saved them. Our dairy industry is just absolutely devastated, continues to be devastated by, what we think is a non-COVID impact in terms of feed prices. But, there's some correlation there. It's definitely not 100% correlated, but, just the disruption in terms of supply chain from COVID's impact is just, it's obliterated anything that's in the production side of the U.S. economy. And the production size of the U.S. economy is not very big. So those are just some of the things. In terms of demand, let's talk about beef demand from COVID. When we have chaos, how do you calculate? How do you function, and determine what beef demand is? It's flying off the shelves because, you're worried about, eating for the next month. And it's been a long time since U.S. consumers have been worried about eating for the next month. So in terms of beef demand, it was just a basic supply and demand, relationship. As that supply was cut at lower levels, obviously, consumers were willing to, if they had dollars, they were willing to spend them to, shore up beef supply to their family. The state of the U.S. restaurant industry, just talking a little bit about U.S. consumer beef demand in terms of working its way through restaurants. It's in the restaurants that it's in, it's strong in those restaurants. One of the issues I'd say is that we've lost about 110,000 restaurants in the U.S. that aren't planning on coming back. So that's a lot of restaurants that aren't selling beef for us anymore. It's going to continue to be important to, get some new restaurants started 2021 throughout the next decade. And the other factor in there is just continuing, the restaurants that are still open still have a lot of restrictions on them in some cases. in terms of capacity, in terms of social distancing. So I don't 100% feel like we're out of the woods yet, even though the last month it just feels like we've exploded here in Florida in terms of opening back up. But there's still, I still feel like we're on that critical level. The federal government, they're saying they're going to maintain support through 2022 now in terms of providing some assistance in terms of loans. So we'll see what happens, but I feel like we're still kind of on the edge. We're still working our way out of this. There's still a lot of, unexpected events out there that we've got to work our way out of. Dale mentioned the plant fire in 2019 in Hutchinson, Kansas. So, I mean, I feel like there's still outliers out there, some negative outliers that, that they're not related to COVID, but they can still cause shocks that, we were still on the brink here in terms of just, surviving in terms of our businesses. So think about how consumers change. They change their, whether they wanted to or not, they change their preferences and they change their eating habits. And their habits have likely been changed for, while they're going back to restaurants and sitting down and eating meals, they've worked their ways into some habits, and they're going to continue consuming a lot of beef protein at home. So the ball is in the consumer's court moving forward in terms of choosing to continue to eat beef and meat proteins. They're going to eat a lot at home. In terms of getting higher prices for meat proteins, it's going to be that they're got to demand meat proteins at higher prices and fill those freezers like they have for the last year in terms of local and regional processing as well. So whenever I'm thinking about the beef cattle market impacts from COVID, now we've gotten to the point where we're not really dealing with the COVID processing and packaging facility issues that we were. So now you're back to increased beef, increased pork, increased poultry supplies that are available. Whenever I talk about CFAP in terms of the payments and the significant recovery in cattle price, there's producers out there that are in the stocker and the feedlot industries, even in the cow-calf industries, but more in the stocker and feedlot industry. If they bought these cattle at the right time, whenever there were significant declines, there was significant profits to be made for some producers. But again, it's for those producers that hit it right. But for most, obviously, there was some economic weakness there. And looking forward in terms of consumer discretionary spending, if you look at what savings have done over the last year, it looks like there's more savings in consumers' bank accounts. We'll see how it plays out. I think the majority of those savings are the top 10% in terms of earners and wealth in this country. But that's kind of where I've got things going in terms of just consumer discretionary spending from the COVID pandemic, from these stimulus checks that we've received. We've got a decline in food service outlets. So it's going to be critical for those ones that we do have open, that are operating, for them to continue to be successful and really move product out the door. The big winners in COVID, the fast food restaurants. For the the restaurants or the fast food chains that they had the drive-through open. I saw a lot of even high-end restaurants down here in Florida create drive-throughs. And I think that's going to be something for us going forward. If we do have any other shakeups in terms of COVID or any other potential virus or disease out there, having that drive-through window is absolutely critical if we're not able to get into some restaurants. Beef cattle markets in terms of looking at moving forward, cheap corn no more. That was something that if we looked at 10-year projections pre-COVID, that we were projecting corn to be in that 350 to 450 range for the next 10 years. Now, I mean, those projections are blown out of the water whenever we look at corn futures, CME corn futures. So, I mean, just significant changes out there post-COVID. Definitely some outliers and definitely some huge impacts to us in terms of the cattle industry. So in terms of evaluating beef cattle producer impacts, I throw this chart up, this figure up here in terms of, at one point, we never really know how many head we're behind. We have estimates, estimates were from anywhere from 500,000 head backed up to, I saw some at 1.3 and 1.4 million head backed up. If we had just run the numbers just based on previous years, based on 2019 numbers, you were supposed to be about 1 million head behind. We were never that far behind though. And so in terms of feed yards, you had cattle backing up. And who wants to market, fat cattle at 100 when the previous year we marketed them at 120? So, we hold cattle longer. We kept them longer. We put additional weight gain on there. They backed up. You had cheap corn. Why not take them, to record carcass levels? You also had open pens. So whenever I talk to some of I work with some cool season forage, some wheat pasture producers in the panhandle of Texas, a little bit in Oklahoma and Kansas. And they've never seen pens. So, it'd been 20, 30 years since they saw so many open pens. Whenever we got to the second half of April, early May, the pens, there's just a lot of pen space. People backed off. If you had, you still had some working capital, but you didn't really know how this was going to play out. Talk about survival of the business. We didn't want to take that additional risk in some cases. Obviously, there was huge changes in terms of cash cattle going significantly lower and box beef prices going significantly higher. Obviously, they're two different products. So you had the one product that was just in great demand, and the other product where you really didn't know. It's an extremely valuable product, but how are we going to get it harvested? There's so much uncertainty around it. That's what really called that divergence in prices. And that's just economics playing itself out in terms of looking at these available resources and moving them through the production pipeline. So I was part of a USDA analysis to determine producer impacts. I also looked at average impacts, the maximum impact that would have been, felt by producers. And what we really saw is we started seeing a decline in U.S. beef exports in early January. Things started shutting down in China. We started seeing a reduction in terms of South Korea and Japan exports to those countries. Those are big players. Those are the biggest players in terms of U.S. beef exports. So we started to see the impacts of COVID back in January in terms of U.S. beef impacts. So what we saw was in terms of cash prices. So we looked at it for, an 800-pound feeder steer, looking at this U.S. feeder cattle price index. And what we saw was a $33 a hundredweight decline from our highest point where we started seeing impacts from COVID to the lowest point there, the first 2 weeks there of April there at 114, $33 a hundredweight, $264 a head. The maximum impact that really should have been felt by some producers if we go from high to low. So that impact for many producers, somewhere in between, $100 to $260 a head is kind of where we thought it was going to be for if we were marketing cattle in those first two quarters of 2020 in terms of cash prices. If we're using risk management in terms of the COVID impacts, this was looking at all contracts. So risk management allows us to, market cattle in the future. We're able to go ahead and take our position. If we were worried about 114, and we went ahead and took our position there at 114, whether that be the second week of March, the first week of April there, we had locked in about $312 a head less per head for this 800-pound feeder steer than we would have back in, the first 2 weeks of January. So obviously there was significant changes in terms of cattle market prices. We know that there was the improvement after the improvement after we moved out of those January just chaos time periods is, we did start moving cattle through processing plants much better once we got to May, and then really started working on getting these animals processed once we got into June and July, the summer months there. In terms of price risk management, the thing I'd like to say about CFAP is the government decided to serve as a price risk management tool in 2020. Now, if CFAP was similar to NAP, we wouldn't have got a single thing. There would have been there was no price risk management that would have taken place if the government assistance would not have stepped in and acted. I would say we would have lost potentially 15 to 25% of producers over the next 5 years if the government would not have stepped in with CFAP. I feel like that's very, very realistic. And I think the larger producers would have gotten a whole lot smaller. The stocker operators that work here in Florida, that's going to be the big guys in terms of the margin operators that I work here in Florida. They were absolutely devastated because they've got cattle coming off of cool season annual forage pasture that row crops are going into. When did they have to market their cattle? The last weekends of March, the first weekends of April. Without government assistance, they would be 50% of what they were because they would not have met any of their loan payments. They would not have met their capital requirements to continue to move forward. If we talked about that in terms of basic economics, we'd also say that the margins are not high enough as we look at where we are currently to adequately utilize price risk management. That's how I feel. As we look at, taking significant steps to use price risk management, the margins just haven't been great enough for us over the last 10 years to utilize price risk management and continue to move forward. That's how I feel about it. In terms of economics, that's just how our industry is structured. So moving forward, just looking at, some of the impacts, long-term beef projections in terms of U.S. beef imports, pretty steady there, but slowly moving higher over the next decade as there's more U.S. consumers that are, demanding ground beef and U.S. beef proteins. But I said I was going to talk a little bit about exports and imports. I just wanted to share kind of where we're going long term, slightly higher, nothing dramatic there. You see the 2020 numbers that really, show the impact that consumers had. We were importing a lot of beef proteins that other countries usually consumed. So we were demanding the product. The U.S. consumers had the dollars. We were taking product that would usually be consumed in other countries, and it was coming into the U.S. because U.S. consumers wanted that product when we were having a difficult time dealing with our protocols. Exports, this is to me, this is the bright spot moving forward, is that we're going to continue to export more beef protein to, Southeast Asia. It's going to continue to grow. They demand our product, a high quality meat protein product, to very wealthy consumers, whether that's getting into China or just staying, with Taiwan and South Korea, Japan, staying with those countries and getting our product in those countries is going to continue to be critical. In terms of price projections, and all these are from FAPRI, I just wanted to share these. There's hope on the horizon in terms of market prices moving higher. So in terms of, having a 2020 low there in terms of looking over the next 10 years there. So we've got 146 to 184 is kind of the projections right now. Just given the different variables that are at play today, this is just based on 500 different evaluations that FAPRI, Food and Agricultural Research Policy Institute, evaluates. Just getting in terms of long-term beef projections, U.S. beef production, you do get out there and, there's going to be a little bit of a sway there in terms of a decline. Beef production, you get 3 years out from now, you start seeing that decline, bottoming there in 2024, 2025, and then potentially starting that next rise in terms of U.S. beef production. Efficiency pays off whether we have a larger or smaller U.S. cattle inventory. So that's kind of where we're going in terms of the production of things. Just wanted to share those slides. Back to, the COVID and progress in beef processing during 2020 and 2021. After we got out of the large wave that we saw there in the second quarter of 2020, it really allowed us to, reset and kind of get back to normal. Even though it's not normal, it's more normal in terms of the processing numbers that we started to see getting into July. You got to that July time period. That's really when we started to see a more normal production level and really got to where we were harvesting our normal levels. It was really the fall before we started to exceed normal production levels and really start working on that backlog. Dale mentioned in terms of additional shifts and weekends, that was everything for us. We would not be where we would never have caught the backlog without additional shifts and without weekends. I just put in here in terms of, beef demand, economics works. If it's demanded, with monetary value in terms of money, it's going to be supplied. I think it's still too soon to say we're good to go. The pandemic's not over. COVID's still out there, causing variants. So, but things are moving very smoothly and we're moving in the right direction. It feels like if we can just continue in this direction, the trend line is looking fantastic for us. So in terms of discussion on the steps that beef processing plants are using to mitigate future disturbances, the thought process there, the discussions that I've had with other economists that are in that Midwest, Southern Plains region, is that processors are now taking it seriously in terms of moving from, unionized skilled labor to more biotechnology, more AI, more AI in the processing facilities to make certain cuts. So we're at the point now where, processing plants are going to change. They're going to be using more technology. Employees that were not sick were not showing up for work, and that really hurt them. In the April time period, that there was employees that did not have COVID, but they were too scared to work, and I don't blame them. I'm just saying that's exactly what happened. Social distancing is tough on economic efficiency. And so that's one of the reasons that they're going to be really pushing AI and pushing increasing biotechnology that's in meatpacking plants. In terms of infrastructure, in terms of the things I've heard over the last 2 months, there is a lot of meatpacking plants that are out there. It is always a function of the relationship between supply and demand. There's a lot of plants that are coming back online, is my understanding, from several of the industry analysts. They're coming back online, whether this is nationally, regionally, and locally. Obviously, regionally and locally, there's a lot of new plants that are in the development stages right now. So a lot of new plants, there's old plants, there's used plants, and there's retired plants that, people have plans for now just because of that new demand. And the new understanding of the importance of our food supply chain. So just risk and concerns. This is just a couple slides of things I'm sharing now with some of my clientele, some of my producers. There's so many risks out there that we're thinking about in terms of global recession, COVID-19. We've still got impacts from African swine fever. That's one of the reasons these corn and soybean prices have significantly increased. Just supply chains, just the disruption, competing meats. Obviously, there's been weather impacts as well. Just a lot of risks and concerns out there. I still have concerns for our margin operators. Cattle feeders, some someone somewhere is still betting on the come. And I think if we run break even numbers, if we look at projections out there, they're betting on the come right now. In terms of placing cattle on feed today, there's a lot of them out there, and we're in a tough situation. This is from the first week of August to the first week of February. Corn's not cheap anymore, 74% higher. Grain sorghum, 113% higher. Soybean meal, 53% higher. DDGs, 93% higher. This is specifically for us in the Southeast U.S. I didn't calculate the numbers for other areas, just looking at our Southern Outlook Conference data here. So, it's a tough environment whenever we think about a lot of our supplementation in the beef cattle industry. Really can be really tough on us. Cattle feeders, I say they continue to bleed. If there's high feed costs, high feeder cattle prices, and low fat cattle prices, long term that just won't work. The easiest way for them to fix this is to pay less for feeder cattle. And I'll just share this with you. Whenever we think about where prices were 2019, 2020, they're very similar to kind of what we saw 2011, 2012 levels. And whenever we, think about cost of production in 2019, 2020, we talk about 2011, 2012 levels in terms of prices. Costs increased significantly between 2011, 2020, and 2012 to 2019 and 2020. So it's a tough environment for us right now. Just got to continue to work through it and look at those the bright areas out there in the future for us. Just wrapping things up. I still think there's no telling what might transpire. I can promise you this is not a normal economic recession. Obviously, house prices don't go up in economic recessions. So there's no telling what may transpire. Usually savings don't increase in economic recessions. What I'm telling producers, and this is kind of what I'm working with on producers in terms of our margin operators, still stay flexible. Think about risk management. There's lots of different ways we can implement risk management. It's not just CME feeder cattle futures. It's not just options. If you're going to use those, you've got to develop a really good relationship with your render, broker, and insurance agent. Identify your marketing window. Just make sure you got cash flow and potential for liquidity. Evaluate what is the first thing I'm going to sell if I have a liquidity issue. I close with this. This is kind of one of the slides that developed early in 2020, before things kind of really opened back up for us in the Sunshine State. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. I think we still need to consider whether that light at the end of the tunnel is either an exit or a train headed right for us. I still think there can be extreme volatility. If we look over the last 10 years, feeder cattle future prices, talking about 800-pound feeder steers, fluctuate $20 a hundredweight in any year. That's $160 a head. There's a lot of volatility out there. It's important for us to have a plan moving forward and be able to act on it as we evaluate really our beef operation. So with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to Steve. We'll have a Q&A, and hopefully I can answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Chris. We do have one question, and I don't. Both of you guys may want to have a go at it or whatever. It says, how are we monitoring beef sales from those purchasing directly from producers? Do you think that will impact the consumer numbers later on down the road?
Okay, so I'll take a small stab at it. In terms of beef sales, purchasing directly from producers, how are we monitoring it? If it's, we do have an estimate of sales that are occurring, and obviously USDA plants, we know those. We also have estimates for state inspected plants. I mean, that's just kind of the only monitoring that I know in terms of really sales. We do also have surveys that go out to producers from the USDA that monitor price for those private beef sales for USDA plants as well as state inspected plants. So that's all I really have seen on quantifying prices that are out there and quantity that's being marketed. Obviously we've seen the shift. Everyone on here has seen a shift in terms of consumers they're looking for, really shoring up their supply of meat proteins, over the, on a yearly basis now. So, and I think that trend will continue. If we don't have shocks though, it'll slow down obviously. But Dale, do you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is maybe one of a new flexible marketing strategies, as Chris mentioned, where producers are beginning to sell shares of the cattle. Essentially, you're buying a half with your neighbor that's down the road that you may not know, but the producer is putting you two together. He's selling you the live animal and then coordinating that processing at the plant for a custom exempt purchase. And so I'm not sure how we're tracking or handling some of those, but I do think we'll see a lot more of that type of unique marketing type arrangement with some of the smaller producers, myself included. My wife is already talking about us doing that, and we don't have cattle anywhere near ready to do that way. So we're trying to gauge what we would do personally, but I do see that as a trend. There's something that we're going to wind up seeing in that direction. To add to just one point that Chris made during his conversation or during his topic, he mentioned all the old, new, and retired plants coming back online, and kind of dovetailing back in with that prior question. What can you do as a county extension agent is if someone is interested in reopening one of those older retired plants, just know that they're going to have to be brought up to federal inspection standards, no matter when they were shut down. So some of the waste components that they were using a screw type that have to go to a different waste management system, infrastructure is going to have to be improved or added to it to get it there. And then also HACCP plants are going to be critical for anyone reopening those plants. So you as a county extension agent may be reaching out and helping to connect that producer with someone who has experience in writing HACCP plans that can help be a consultant for them. Is going to put them on much better footing as they start to try and reopen some of these older plants. Anything on that, Chris?
Absolutely. Federal guidelines are strict, and they're going to have to make some moves. I know that there's a retired plant in Texas and a retired plant in South Carolina about to come back online. But those are, when I mentioned those two specifically, those are big packers that are operating those two plants. Will be done. Some of these smaller or regional plants, it is going to take, they're going to, depend on extension to be there and to provide some additional assistance. And I think, on Ashley's question earlier, it's just being a part of the conversation. And, Ashley, I see your name everywhere on NACA Animal Science usually. So I know you're going to be a part of the conversation and just being there. We all have different programs. We all have different areas that we can, provide assistance. And I think that's just being a part of the conversation and seeing what we can do to assist our clientele and help make them as successful as we possibly can.
Thank you. Any other questions? That's the only one I see in the chat box right now.
Chris or Dale, I have a quick question. As far as carcass weights and cheap corn, what do you kind of see that kind of balancing, or, in the next few years here? Do you see the carcass weights just going to keep going up in that, or maybe stabilize? Because we've had some really big carcasses going throughout West here the last several months here.
Okay, so if the question is for me, in terms of carcass weights, it's gonna be tough to get, it's gonna be tough to get them bigger. The cow is gonna have to get bigger. But yeah, I mean, they're huge, and I mean, they're coming down. High corn prices are gonna bring them back down to reality. So yeah, I mean, corn for the next 12 months it does not look like it's, you know, in the cattle feeders' hand. You know, whenever corn goes higher, the value of forage in the Southeast becomes significantly higher, as well as we take animals to higher weights. So, you know, while we still provide supplementation in the Southeast, let corn go as high as it wants to for our cow calf and stocker operators that want to retain the animal to preconditioning and, you know, selling 850 pound steers, 750 pound heifers. As long as we're doing it on, you know, just average quality forages with supplementation at 0.25%, 0.5% of body weight, we're going to be fine. But those that really depend on feed stuff, you know, the price of corn sets the price of every feed stuff almost. You know, as long as there's a significant, you know, if there's a absolutely significant supply of something, that's the only way we're going to find some alternatives that are competitively advantaged, that really could change things for us. But I think, you know, higher feedstuff prices are here to stay with us at least for the next year, and it's going to bring those carcass weights down and potentially reduce some of the number of days that they're going to have on feed. Probably you're going to see some backgrounders out there in Kansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska try to take cattle a little bit longer in terms of grazing them out there in the Flint Hills. Kind of, that's what I'm thinking I'm going to see.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And if the corn process don't do it, I think the smaller regional processors that are now kind of taking on that extra bunch that the larger processors can't. They have a really hard time processing large animals, and so they're going to be pushing their clientele to send them to me earlier. Don't let them get so big because I can't handle it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the amount of meat versus fat in the past is gonna flip flop to the point that you know, the producer is not going to get quite the meat that they expected out of that animal too. And so I think just a more so a grounding, as Chris put it, bring them back down to earth is it's going to happen one of two ways, in either price or overall size and labor requirements.
All right, any other questions? If you've got one, type it in the chat box. I don't see any in there now.
Well, thank you, Dale and Chris and Steve. Thank you for moderating. Just a couple of reminders here. There'll be a follow-up evaluation sent shortly if you're registered for this. So please take a couple minutes and go online and fill out that evaluation. And the recordings will also be sent out as far as for this webinar today. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time.